Afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Darlene Ruscitti, the Regional Superintendent of Schools for DuPage County, and really proud to be a co-sponsor with Illinois Civics in this four-part series, Courageous Conversations, Race, Equity, Justice, and Progress. On July 20th, we hosted our first conversation. It was titled How to Raise a Socially Conscious Anti-Racist Child. And it was particularly of importance, I believe, to both me, to many, but to me on a personal level and also on a professional level. Because I believe as much as I do and support my children and grandchildren and in my professional world, really trying to support the work of equity in so many ways. One of my first learnings at that very first opportunity on Courageous Conversations was I still have so much more that I know I can do and that I will be doing, as well. And I'm particularly proud of this afternoon's Courageous Conversation as well, partly because one of the strong connections that the DuPage Regional Office of Education has is to the Democracy Schools and the Democracy Schools Network. I think it is one of the best initiatives that is out there. It has so many important components to it, especially not just in democracy, but also in equity and social emotional aspects and knowledge and creating so many different things for our children. So really proud to have all of the members here and administrators. And in particular, though this is important in this four-part series, has a component for community, as a component for teachers, for parents. I think the administrators, as administrators here in DuPage County and across the country, we have the potential to really do more, want more, be more for our children. And I think that's what today is going to, be about. We can lead so much by example, demonstrate, the intentionality of the work that we're doing, demonstrate too our greatness of heart. And I think most importantly as administrators, the political will that it is going to take to really continue to make our society an anti-racist society. So again, thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn this over to Mary Ellen Daneels. She is not only one of the leaders in the Illinois Civics Initiative, but she is also the leader of the Illinois Civics Hub. So welcome, Mary Ellen, and I'm turning this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to touch base for just a moment because we really want to hear from our panelists today. But as Darlene introduced, my name is Mary Ellen Daneels, and I am the Civics Instructional Specialist for the Illinois Civic Mission Coalition, which is housed so graciously in the DuPage Regional Office of Education, which is really the civics hub for the state of Illinois. And this is part, again, of a four-part series on Courageous Conversations. If you have questions for the panelists today, we really encourage you to ask those questions using the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat box and bring issues to the forefront for you, to our panelists, throughout today's session. In addition, as Darlene said, we will be recording this, and this will be shared on the DuPage Regional Office of Education website later, probably this evening. So again, the topic of today is really a school-wide approach to centering the lived experiences of our students. And this is a panel discussion that will be led by Sonia Mathew, Program Manager for the Democracy Program at the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, with esteemed panelists from various democracy schools throughout Illinois. So I'm going to yield the floor now to Sonia to introduce herself a bit more, and then to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, the context in which they're coming at this work for, and then we'll start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. So as Mary Ellen said, I'm Sonia Mathew. I'm a program officer at the McCormick Foundation and have the honor and privilege to work with a tremendous group of high schools across the state of Illinois that are called democracy schools. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Democracy Schools Initiative, we have a recognition process where schools that are really committed to strengthening school-wide civic engagement and civic learning have an opportunity to assess themselves around civic learning practices, and then also the organizational supports that are in place to sustain civic learning. And today we have three educators and administrators from three different democracy schools, and we're really excited to hear from their experiences about what it means to center the lived experiences of students and think about what the role of administrators is in this work. Just because the role that administrators and really thinking about the vision and leadership at the top and how that is really encouraged throughout the school is of utmost importance. And so hopefully you'll learn a lot of lessons from our panelists today. I enjoyed having prep conversations with them and just learning more about their work, and excited to share with you all. So I'm going to actually turn it over to each of them to just give a brief introduction about your name, your role, and just kind of, why you're passionate about this. And so let's start with Jason, please.
All right, good afternoon. It's good to be with you all. I'm Jason Janczak. I'm the Social Studies Department Chair at Grayslake Central High School in Grayslake, Illinois. If you've been to Great America, we're just west of that. That's about how Grayslake is known. This is starting my 7th year at Grayslake in this role, my 20th year overall at Grayslake. And the reason that I'm so fired up about this is that for the longest time we were hearing from students that social studies, you just kind of took it to take it, right? It kind of happened to you. You didn't experience it. And so we're in the process of transforming our curriculum so that students experience social studies instead of checking it off the box for a graduation requirement. So we'll flush that out in the discussion a little bit later on, but that's really what I'm excited to talk about today.
Thanks, Jason. Eileen, can you introduce yourself, please? And unmute.
Sure. So I'm Eileen McMahon. I am the principal at Maine West High School, which is in Des Plaines, Illinois. And my point of orientation would be O'Hare Airport. We are we're about 5 minutes from O'Hare, almost contiguous with the airfields, which is, sometimes I do look out the window and feel a little wistful, but anyway. As for why I'm passionate about this, Jason, you made me think. I think a lot of times school was something that happened to students too, not just social studies, but school in general. And I think it's a mission for us, if every student has the agency to define what a meaningful life looks like for him, her, theirselves, then it's up to us to create the space for them to discover that, explore it, and pursue it with the skills they need to achieve it. So I'm passionate about this because I think for a long time we told people what should be meaningful to them. And I think we're hopefully situated to listen to them a little bit more now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Eileen. And Billson.
Yes. Hi, my name is Billson Rasavongxay, Department Chair at Hinsdale Central High School in the western suburbs of Hinsdale. We've been doing this work at Hinsdale now since I've been there from Hinsdale South, and I'm quite passionate about this work myself. Growing up in a far northwest suburb of Elgin and being in a diverse, community, I just kind of pushed that passion along through my own personal journey, and I'm trying to push along in my professional journey now. I think now more than ever, we could use this critical mass, critical moment in history to kind of really push social studies and civics and trying to center our own lived experiences, not only with our staff, but of our students as well. So really just trying to use this time to push as much as possible and centering their lives in our curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And so just our setup for today, so the audience is aware, we've got some questions that we're going to have the panelists explore for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A throughout. And if you have questions, Mary Ellen will just kind of be monitoring the chat and, interjecting questions as needed as well if folks want to we can be flexible with the agenda and just also be responsive if people need clarification on various things that are stated. But Mary Ellen also just shared a link to the lived civics framework. And so this idea of lived civics is one that, as we were thinking about democracy schools, really centering the work of democracy schools around the race and identity of our students. And so when we talk about what it means to look at the lived experiences, that lived civics framework is definitely a foundational piece for us understanding that. And so this first question for all of you to think about and share with us is, what does it mean for you in your role to center the lived experiences of students. And can you talk about some examples in your school of how you've been able to do that? And we'll start with Jason for this one, please.
Absolutely. So in the process, one of the things that we just went through with renewing our certification with the Democracy School Network is giving out a survey. We use a lot of data to make decisions. And one of the things that we found is the initial first look of the data, everything was relatively okay. Like things were going well, we were going in the right direction. But then we took it a step further and broke it down by race, and we broke it down by gender. And then as we did that through Sonia's organization, it was eye-opening to see exactly what was going on, is that our white students were feeling fine. They felt they had the voice. They felt their experiences were being met. But our Latinx students, our students of color, our Asian students, they weren't so satisfied, right? And so then we took it a step further and we're able to partner with Loyola University, with their partnership with the Democracy School, and kind of uncover it a little bit more. And so what they came in and did was some cohort studies with our white students, with our students of color, with our Latinx students and our Asian students. And we actually got the stories behind the data. And what we found was truly fascinating. They actually came in and did the cohort on March 13th, the day everything kind of shut down for us. And we were able to write that out, and they were able to write that out for us. And in reading it, students weren't seeing themselves in our curriculum. That the history of students of color was the same history they had experienced in 5th grade and in 8th grade, and it wasn't different. And so that was kind of an eye-opening experience for us. And so we're just beginning in that process of adjusting our curriculum. Billson, we're using one of the tools that I believe Hinsdale uses with students. We get the student feedback on whether or not they see themselves in the curriculum. So that's going to be our work this year, is our teachers are going to be asking themselves, where do our students see themselves in the curriculum? And hopefully our students will be able to experience that more as the curriculum gets revised.
Great, thanks. Billson.
Thanks, Jason, for that tidbit. That feedback survey that Jason referenced was what I'm going to call like a whiteness audit of our U.S. history or AP U.S. history classes. Our students took a survey trying to figure out if they have, their narratives and their culture's narratives built into the curriculum. Our staff took a survey about how we could adjust our curriculum and our pedagogy to meet the needs of those lived experiences as well. And it was interesting because when Jason mentions Loyola, we've been working with them very much in this whiteness audit and trying to get feedback from our students and staff. We're doing our best to not globalize these experiences either. They don't just stand for a group of people or a group of marginalized folks. It's really just these individual stories that we've come across in Hinsdale, working both at South and at Central. There's a great deal of diversity, not only in terms of ethnic and racial background, but also these personal narratives as well. So even as an Asian male, my experiences differ quite differently than other Asian males within, the western suburbs. So we've done our best to try to really celebrate, our student groups that we have, whether it be our MSA, which is our Muslim Student Association, or our Spanish Club, and try to have students tell their stories going into their other classrooms, going into other social studies classes, and really give a different perspective rather than just what they see in a traditional textbook or their traditional schooling. This past February, we had a student town hall, which really centered around identity and race, and we invited mainly English and social studies classes throughout our building. Every period of the day, there were about 8 to 12 students who wanted to share those lived experiences. For them as a student at Hinsdale Central, what were their experiences on a day-to-day? It was very student-led, roundtable discussion afterwards, where each of the student presenters got to answer very frank and honest questions from their peers. And it took a little bit of training for us to make sure that students can handle very complex questions, trying to figure out intent versus, just outright ignorance. But it really opened up a lot of eyes because it's student to student versus rather than, you know, a staff member or a teacher talking about a different culture in a specific class. It was very much their own lived experiences and trying to showcase themselves in our school and our community.
Great, thank you, Billson. And Eileen, you know, what ways has Maine West centered this work?
Well, I think it's interesting that my colleagues spoke about how the students saw themselves in their school and in their curriculum, and it kind of speaks to the way we had to look at the way our students saw ourselves in the imagery and the symbols around our school. Our school's demographic has changed significantly in the last 15 years. From being a predominantly white school, we are now about 50% white, and other mainly Latino, but also some African American and Asian and South Asian students mixed in. And yet we had a dominant culture of whiteness that was represented strongly in our imagery and not troubled by any of the discourse of the school. It just sort of flowed over everybody like water, the way culture does. We are the Warriors. Our nickname is the Warriors, and our mascot has been, since the school's opening in 1959, our mascot has been an image of an Indigenous American. And that really changed in 2017, which was my first year on the staff as an assistant principal. And the transition away from using images that are widely recognized to be disrespectful has challenged the school in a lot of ways. And I think it was significant because many of the students didn't really question the imagery. You know, they're kids and they come into the high school, and our kids love our school. It's a really spirited place. The connections to the school community are very deep. And it never came up really that there was any sort of a problem in having a white student dress in a costume and wear a headdress and do a dance really similar to the Chief Illinois dance in Urbana-Champaign. And when that went away, some of our students of color were actually the most offended and upset that we changed the mascot. I think what's interesting is that, to me, there was a fair amount of community pushback, and alumni were pretty frustrated and remain so. There were some articles in the newspaper, and what held my interest and convictions in place was a story of a student here who had written a college essay about being of Native American descent and seeing representations of her people all around the school that didn't look anything like or feel anything like her lived experience as an Indigenous student. And so her counselor shared the outlines of this essay with us, and I asked if we could see it. And she said, well, let me ask the child and her mom for permission. And the mom said, no, it's not safe in this community for us to be perceived as anti-warrior. And I thought, that's a student who does not see herself in our school. Moreover, sees herself represented and distorted by our school, and she has no voice. And so it was an interesting education in what it means to have power. I mean, I think I have studied aspects of the power that have accrued to me over my life as a white woman, but my positional power in that moment made me just feel like I have to speak for that student because she doesn't have the power to speak for herself in this culture or even in this dynamic. And that's really stayed with me in the recent, in the events of the spring with the school closures because of the pandemic, and then also into the early summer with the unrest around issues of racial justice. We have been at the very beginning of a journey forming a group called Students Organized Against Racism. That SOAR group is district-wide, and it was just getting off the ground. And they had many virtual meetings over the course of the spring that I was so grateful that they were able to do because they needed that space. And we have more work to do with our staff. We have more work to do with the dominant culture among the students and families in our school. But I feel like there's an increasing recognition that, again, that agency I spoke of before, that's what we're supposed to be here to be doing. And that a traditional model of school that didn't open the space for that isn't going to serve our families. So we're hoping to make that shift.
So, what I appreciated in all of your responses is how you're all thinking about your personal identities as educators and the ways that have really shaped you, but then also how, you're then centering these experiences that your students are bringing to your schools. And, this next question is also getting at to what extent are your colleagues, doing that kind of work, and what supports have your colleagues in your buildings needed to do this, and what strategies have been effective in working with your colleagues that might be helpful for our audience members. Let's start with Billson this time.
Thanks, Sonia. It's interesting because I think as social studies folks, we always want to do this work, but we just might not know exactly how, or might not have the capacity or the language to really describe what we're trying to do. I come at this one from like two different camps. Like one being, let's tell more stories. Let's give more voices to our students to give them more agency, as Eileen mentioned. And then there are a lot of other folks who say, I really need support. I really need evidence. I really need data. I really need to know my work is actually working. So I approach this work in our building twofold, and I ask for more student voice, and I ask for more stories to be told in classes in a more non-traditional way, rather than saying you need to do this, and here's a checklist, and here's a format, and try to give students more freedom to do that. But also taking the data from the Loyola feedback was really, really important to help move some of these colleagues as well. It's like, this is a pattern. Here are some data that suggests that our Asian students feel comfortable with what they're learning about themselves, but our Latinx students do not. And while our white students feel they're very comfortable in talking about some of the positives and negatives of all of these cultures, it's really only happening in AP US history courses. And why is that? And shouldn't College Board and the pacing and the curriculum be such where they might not have as much freedom to talk about these things? Shouldn't a US history class at the college level in our building have more freedom to do some of these things? So when colleagues attempt this work, they really need that support, and I would consider it to be like really explicit support from leaders of the building, whether it be DCs or anything above. I also feel like colleagues need support within like themselves. So at Hinsdale Central, we recently created affinity groups where our staff of color got together and met a few times in the spring and a few more times in the summer to really kind of kickstart this idea of giving more stories and more testimonials, because we feel like those move minds and hearts more so than maybe something else. And then there's a White Allies affinity group that we created as well to try to help our white colleagues kind of support each other through this work. We are on the very beginning stages of that. There are pluses and minuses as we go through this work, but I think that the way that we feel about it is like we're making progress, and whether that might be fast or slow for people, we're making progress. I always want to step on the gas, but then I figure out, we've been on this journey as social studies folks for quite a while. We might not be able to move as fast as some other folks in other departments. So it does take a team, it does take a village. And I think the key word there is, we really need to support each other and explicitly support each other to others as well.
Great, thank you, Billson. Eileen, what are your thoughts?
I think what has proven the most important need, and the things in the places where we've been able to make progress as a staff, that support has come through conversations. So from an individual conversation to a group conversation, we brought SEED to the district, not this past year, but the year before, as an opportunity to foster conversations among staff that could help us establish a systematic way to inspect our identities and the systemic aspects of power in our structure. People really relished that. We had a waiting list. We still have a waiting list. People have really been very enthusiastic about that. And that has played out, I think, in that, well, at least the way I hope it plays out is the analogy I used once was herd immunity, since that seems to be topical as we talk about COVID, that anti-racist work really is herd immunity in some ways, that as you start to develop racial consciousness and a sensitivity to issues of justice and the tools to have conversations that can be uncomfortable sometimes, then eventually you find that strength in a group support. Maybe the most salient example of a conversation that I've found beneficial and successful this year happened, it's a bookend actually. So around homecoming, our students paint the windows that surround the cafeteria with imagery that connects what their clubs and activities are doing to the theme of homecoming. And our African American Students Club painted, it was an outer space theme this year, and they painted a moonscape, and out of the moon came a fist, and they had labeled it Black Power. And I was there in the afternoon when all of the groups were painting their windows, and I love to walk around and chat with the kids and see how the designs are taking shape. And I loved the drawing, it was terrific. But when I came in the next morning and it had been finished, I was met right off the bat on my way into my office by a couple of staff members who were really challenged, really affected emotionally by what they saw and found it threatening, and white staff members, I imagine I should point out. So, and in one case I said, well, you know what, come and have lunch with me. Let's sit down and talk about it. He said, are you okay with this? And I said, absolutely. Let's talk about why. And in that conversation, I drew on the Courageous Conversations About Race protocol from Beyond Diversity, which is the Pacific Education Group's workshop on having cross-racial dialogue, and just having the space to say, it's okay to have this discussion. We're gonna recognize, what's personal and immediate to us, and we're just gonna sort of follow a few specific protocols, conditions to have this conversation productively. And we got to the point where just embracing multiple perspectives, seeing this from the kids' point of view, recognizing, the sponsor at one point, when I approached her to talk about the poster, she said, I know, I'll take it down. And I said, no, I'm not coming to you to have you take it down. I'm coming to tell you, don't worry about it. I've got it. There's some blowback, but it's okay. I want you to know about it, but I don't want you to take this down. And she said, I regulate my Blackness every day that I'm in this building. And when I had the conversation with my colleague who wanted to regulate their Blackness, the group's Blackness, and engaged him in trying to see it from their perspective, he was able to, in a way that just made me feel really proud of him and hopeful for what it can mean when those conversations can happen with more frequency. And a nice little footnote was that recently, when many communities had protests after the murder of George Floyd, and Des Plaines had one, and I got text from this very staff member who had felt so threatened by this imagery. And he's showing me pictures of the protests with his wife and kids and holding a sign. So I thought, there's movement when we can make the space to have the conversation, and that conversation is critical.
Jason, Grays Lake.
Yeah, I have to follow that. Wow. That was a pretty powerful story, Eileen. So I want to go back to something that Billson said about having those conversations and using the data from Loyola, because we're in the same boat, right? And when we roll this out here, or as we roll this out, I'm going to imagine there's going to be a lot of staff buy-in. Our students are saying that they're not seeing themselves in the curriculum. Let's run the survey from Hinsdale and see where we're at and everything. Okay, we need to move forward with this. Most likely that is going to mean moving our US history and world history curriculums from chronological to thematic. I would imagine some of our teachers' moods and excitement about this change is going to all of a sudden disappear when we're talking about essentially chucking our curriculum and starting it over again, right? And so I think other things that our colleagues need are support, or professional development. When we talk about inquiry-driven assignments, we use the Right Question Institute. For their PD, we also use one of Eileen's teachers, Dan Fouts, who's over at Maine West. He's got a teach differently approach, and it's fascinating to get the kids talking about claims and counterclaims, right? And so there's PD there, professional development there. And so as we move forward through this process, I think our colleagues are going to they're going to need to know that we have their backs and that the professional development is there. And then from an administrator standpoint, us as administrators, when we come in to observe something new, if it goes great, we need to be able to celebrate it with our teachers. And if it goes not so great, we need to have a judgment-free autopsy on what went wrong with the lesson and how it could get better, right? And then the last thing I think is, as we start to have these uncomfortable conversations for some of our teachers, or conversations that our teachers may deem uncomfortable, or teaching content that may seem controversial in their eyes, we need to let them know that we have their back, very similar to what Eileen mentioned, that, hey, I've got this, there's going to be some blowback, I have your back, because there's going to be those moments, there's going to be those subjects that are going to bring up controversy. And we need to be able to process through that, maybe be proactive with it with our teachers, but then also make sure that we don't scare them out of actually having the conversations. In our district this year, we did a book club over the summer, Not Light But Fire by Matthew Kay, great book. And it's kind of nudging the elephant a little bit into letting our teachers know, hey, it's not maybe as scary as you think to have some of these difficult conversations in these classrooms. So this has been really effective. The conversations that have been happening over the summer with our staff members in this book have been awesome. But just that full support that Eileen was talking about, she had the staff members, she was having those conversations. I think once staff realize that we're there for them and we're in this together with them, that you're gonna see a lot more confidence and a lot more willingness to try new things.
Yeah, I think just a couple key themes I'm hearing from all of your stories, and even that story from Eileen was definitely so powerful. It's the second time I'm hearing it, and I'm still like, it's hard not to be moved by that. But you know, there is this piece around it. All of you are really addressing this directly, right? And I think oftentimes, especially around issues of race, our tendency has been to avoid some of those conversations, hide it under the rug. It's not necessary to have these kinds of dialogues. And I think in some ways you've all spoke to some of the challenges of doing some of this work, especially as you think about supports that teachers need. But you know, what are some other challenges that your school has faced in really being actively anti-racist, which I think, you know, there is this idea of being actively anti-racist and supporting belonging and inclusion, and you know, how have you worked to address some of those challenges? And we'll start with Eileen this time.
Well, I think maybe you previewed the answer to the question when you highlighted how active it has to be. That if we revert to the default, no matter what the school system is, what, you know, academic system, the discipline system, even facilities, who has access to leadership roles in student organizations, which of those student organizations have access to power in the principal and admin's office. And I think even down to decolonizing the curriculum, for those of us who have been steeped in white culture and schools that have been steeped in a white dominant culture for a long time, challenging those conventions means challenging power. And most people don't like to give up power, whether they reflect or deliberate on it or not. They don't like to give up power. I don't necessarily see it myself as an inherent loss, but it's hard not to frame it that way, I think, if you haven't done some of the work. And I think none of the progress that we've been seeing, which has been compelled by what our kids need and the genuine care for our students that to a person in this building I do see, but none of it would really have taken root without support from the district to have opportunities to expose people to SEED. We had plans to have all of the admin participate in Beyond Diversity in the spring and summer. It didn't really happen. We'll see how that could work. And even some of the, you know, staff, it's all been sort of it's very democratic, small d, where the staff are generating their own momentum to do book clubs, to do reading, and not just leave it at book clubs either. So I think from there, as there's that groundswell for what people are trying to, their hearts are there, and then you have to organize action. So I think it's just a matter of structuring conversations to look at things like our discipline systems and see, if I can, I would really like to structure our entire building around a conversation about justice and what justice is. What is academic justice, especially in a context of back and forth between remote learning when some kids have access to resources that other kids don't have. So what is justice in that framework? What is justice when we have a lot of folks who are conventional, attached to conventional discipline policies that are actually about white culture? And how do we have a conversation about what rigor and success means when it's not assimilationist? And I think those are the kinds of things that we still need to do. And our ability to have conversations has been at least a little bit disrupted this spring, and heading into the fall with ongoing uncertainty about how we can convene and have that dialogue. I think too, with the events of the summer and the spotlight on issues of racial justice throughout not just the country but through the world, I feel like there's a tension between wanting to do something immediately because this is urgent, this is necessary, these are the lived experiences of our students of color in and out of our building. And then also knowing that in order to be sustainable, systems have to change in a way that is sound, like the architecture of change has to be sound to be sustainable. So it's not very satisfying to be an incrementalist, but at the same time, you have to build foundations. I think that's a big challenge for me to navigate. I haven't really quite got the answer yet.
Jason.
So in Grace Lake, one of our biggest issues is that our staff doesn't look like our students. We are 98% white. Students of color, Latinx students, Asian students can go all 4 years without seeing a teacher with a similar background. And so one of the biggest struggles that we are facing is how do we recruit and retain teachers from various backgrounds to better meet the diverse needs of our students, right? And so one of the things that we're looking at is a Grow Your Own program where we are talking with students from a variety of backgrounds and kind of partnering with the College of Lake County. It's not official yet, but it's in the process of essentially having a dual credit Teacher Ed 100 class with the College of Lake County. The students would be partnered with a teacher at Grayslake Central. They would get dual credit for their entry-level teacher education class in hopes of recruiting and retaining students to the profession, not just the school, but to the profession from a diverse group of backgrounds, our Latinx students, our students of color, Asian students. And so we're just in the first year of that. There was a lot of interest from both teachers and students. The students wanted to partner with a teacher. We're going to continue to flesh that out, hopefully this year as we go forward with that. The other thing that we face in Grayslake is there's some blowback still from the community that the discussion of controversial issues is considered indoctrinating by some. Like you're not discussing this, you're just indoctrinating our kids to see this view. And it's always, it's a tough line to kind of toe. And so as we continue to just talk a little bit more about the why our curriculum is evolving, we hope to get some community buy-in with that. And then I had one other point, which I forgot here. Oh, sorry, there it is. The survey was particularly interesting. We talked about the survey that we got back, or the conversations we had from Loyola. One of the other things that we need to be able to break down as teachers and as administrators is not necessarily looking to our students of color, our Latinx students, our Asian students for the answer. Our students have told us that when it comes to some of these controversial topics, the conversation stops and all eyes turn to the Asian student, or all eyes turn to the Latinx student, and that makes the students even feel more uncomfortable. And how do we break teachers from and administrators from doing that and reaching out to just those students? So I think the kids are telling us, don't put us up on a pedestal, include us, but don't put us up on a pedestal. And so that's going to be kind of a mindset shift for our teachers as we move forward with this work.
Thank you, Jason. Billson.
Yeah, in Hinsdale, we have similar issues to what Jason talked about at Grays Lake, where our staff don't look like our students. You know, I think for the most part, our staff are really hesitant into having these types of conversations in the classroom. And it's not because of fear of pushback from parents or community or from students. It's just that they don't have the necessary skills or confidence and capacity to navigate such controversial things, where some social studies folks might not think about it as controversial at all. I think so they tiptoe around issues. They want to do the work, but they don't exactly know who is there to support that work. And I say that in multiple ways, because I feel like there are folks out there who are in silos, and they are doing things and trying to do things and taking risks and learning from them and sharing them with colleagues. But if the building doesn't know about it because there are no celebrations, or, you know, on the other end, no complaints, it just happens and it kind of dwindles away. And I think as leaders and administrators, we have to really engage in this work very, very explicitly. You know, whether it be getting it out in newsletters or getting it out on Twitter blasts, or having those types of conversations where we start to normalize it much more than we used to. I think it could go a long ways. Recently, our district started a district-wide cultural and equity leadership team that's made up of board members, administrators, parents, students, teachers, and other leaders in our building. I'll be honest, we've met once, okay, and we're doing the best that we can to really use this to jumpstart some of our jumpstart our strategic plan. You know, we went through a strategic plan audit and we reviewed it, and we wanted to make sure that this was included. And then as a team and as district realized, you know, this work, this racial equity work, this social justice work is the plan. And to Eileen's point, like, how do we, and let's steal her term here, decolonize all the things that we do in a systemic way in a traditional institution like American schools? So that work is really, really challenging. But I think the more that we try to normalize those types of conversations, whether it be with one or two colleagues or in a department meeting or even a school-wide meeting, I think it could go a long ways into making people feel more comfortable going to others saying, hey, I tried this and I was really vulnerable and I need to learn from it. Or I had this conversation with a parent and this is how we reacted. Do we feel like it's the right thing? So going into the fall, a lot of us as leaders in Hinsdale are starting to get together and do roundtables and play out scenarios and do like a role play of, this is a scenario that came across my desk. How did you deal with it? Or how would you deal with it if we are to deal with it again? It's kind of like a coaching model going into this racial equity work is going to be very difficult for us as DCs, I think, because teachers often come to us before they go to anybody else. It's a work in progress. We got a long ways to go, but I think facing the challenges head on and being really explicit about the support is really key.
Wonderful. I'm hoping folks are finding some really great resources and things to think about. I think one final question I had for you all to discuss with the group here, and some of you started to speak a little bit about this. I think Billson with the Culture and Equity Leadership Team, because they're engaging some families, and I think Jason, you talked about so how you've gotten feedback from families. But in what ways is your school? We've talked about the ways that we've supporting teachers in this. How do we support and engage families in this important work? We'll start with Jason.
All right, just want to make sure. Yeah. So we are just starting with this. This is a huge area of growth at Grays Lake Central, and I think as we move forward in this process, I would like to reiterate to our administration as they move forward to hear the stories behind the numbers. Right. I opened with that in question one, is that it really didn't hit hard for that data until we heard the students' stories. And so I think as we move forward with this process and we send survey data out to our families about the curriculum, about their experiences, to look beyond the numbers and hear the stories behind the numbers. And I think we'll get a lot more information out of that. So as we head down that road, and we should be doing that in September, that's going to be our message to our district administration is, okay, we got this data. What are the stories? What are the experiences? Because once you hear those stories and experiences, it puts a whole lot more context into those numbers.
Billson?
Oh, Jason just steals the words out of my mouth. I think the stories are great. I'm working with a colleague at Hinsdale South. Her name is Aisha Truman. She uses this term leading with love, and she put out a blast to the community. Are there stories and experiences of students or staff that they would like to share, and they could submit it through an anonymous like Google form, where we're collecting these stories of not only our current students and our current staff, but also alumni. And there are student alumni groups out there from both Hinsdale South and Hinsdale Central who are doing this work. And we're really trying to engage, those students and alum and using, youthful voices in this progress. I mentioned the cultural and equity leadership team, and a part of that, we're actually going into the community then rather than asking the community to come to us to try to get feedback and do a little bit more outreach. Staff members are trying to think about like a book club for the community, or how do we gather resources for the community. I think District 2, 4, in Aurora and Naperville, they've done a lot of great stuff gathering resources that they've put out to the community and to staff as well. So we're just really trying to do that outreach through social media, through emails, through newsletters, and really trying to gather voices as much as possible.
And Eileen, last but not least.
Well, I definitely heard a lot that resonated with me in what you just said. But one piece in particular was about not just serving the families that come to you, right? But you have to go out and get them. And I feel like that's one aspect of my leadership that I really need to attend to this year, is not just serving the families that seek us out, but actively seeking out the families that we serve. And I think one of the ways that we have to think about doing that is part of the continuous process of inspecting who we are and how we're structured. Is our building really linguistically accessible? I have these monthly parent meetings, and what am I doing actually to make sure that families feel welcome and know that this is their school? I think we have been so traditionally a white school that we haven't always been mindful of that communication, because by default, most of our families understood the messages that we were sending, implicit and explicit. And I think we need to be more intentional if that's really the goal. So I consider that a major goal for me. And I also think that that's probably how I would lead my staff, in that, we're not always great about making phone calls home if we're not sure about the language that is spoken in the home. And, there are options for us. There are resources for us. As a district, we're only just starting to have the kinds of conversations about really consistent and automatic translation services, so that we don't have to wonder like, oh, well, who can I get to translate it? That's just kind of how we do what we do. And that's all pretty new. So we have to, I think truthfully, it feels like we should already be there, but we aren't. So now we have to go there and get there. And we did write a proposal for a family outreach coordinator that I think will be accepted when we have a minute to talk about that in advance of, when we're not trying to plan school 6 different times and then changing it every 2 minutes. But I do feel like that's a start. And I think sometimes when you conceive of that work, or you even begin the conversations, it seems like that work is external. Like, oh, we'll have a family outreach coordinator, so this person will have that job and then they'll serve our families. But actually that job is almost as much internal, because it's an in-reach coordinator in some ways to help us inspect how we're opening doors and creating gravity to pull people in instead of make them knock on our door. So that's just one aspect of what I hope can accomplish in the year to come.
Yeah, just, it's such an important reminder about how, you know, families and schools and, you know, that local community, there's so much work that needs to be done to make sure that they both can be resources for each other and really strengthen this work that's happening. So I think we do have some time for Q&A, and so
We have one question. Could you talk a little bit more about the process with Loyola and maybe how those resources from Loyola may in the future be shared more broadly with people? Thank you.
I could go ahead and start with that. So we ended up with a partnership with Loyola as the Democracy School process was a renewal, I believe, for 7 years. And we had to do student survey data, as well as a few other pieces of information that we submitted with that to them. From there, based upon that information, the McCormick Foundation and Sonia figured out that we had a couple areas of growth, and one of them was student voice was the big one that kind of showed through there. And the McCormick Foundation came up with a strategic partnership with Loyola for us and Hinsdale's, and I believe it was Curie and one other school. And so there's a cohort of us that are all democracy schools that are working with Loyola on the various areas of growth or perceived growth that the data showed that we needed. So that's how that partnership started. And then we've been partnering with them for the past year. We're going to continue again this year as we work with them. And that's going to kind of take on a life of its own. But that partnership started based upon the data from a couple of years ago.
And thanks, Jason, for getting us started on that. And if you're asking specifically about, you know, the survey or the feedback, Loyola helped develop a whiteness audit of our curriculum where we ask questions like, do you see yourself in the curriculum? Do you see positives of Native Americans in the curriculum, and so on and so forth? And could you provide some examples of that? And they were so gracious to take that data and develop like a summary or report for our democracy school leaders to try to figure out how could we approach changing our curriculum and our pedagogy after receiving that feedback and the survey data.
I don't see another question right now. Maybe Sonia can talk a little bit about what if other schools are interested in this Loyola process? Is there any thought of institutionalizing it or another tool that's similar? Thank you.
So I think it's actually something that we've talked to Loyola about. How can we make that tool accessible to other democracy schools or other schools that might be interested in using something like that? And so we're hopeful that, and I think that there is some interest in being able to share that and distribute it more broadly. And also just to build on Jason's point as to how this partnership started, is that there were, you know, a number of schools, actually I think 7 schools that all went through the assessment process last year that all prioritized, you know, growth areas and goals around strengthening school climate through inclusion. And there were different ways that those schools really wanted to do that. And so the idea was, how do we create a smaller, essentially a professional learning community of democracy schools that all wanted to focus on that issue, and then find a partner that can support those democracy schools. And we put out a request for proposals, and Loyola seemed to be a really good fit in being able to meet the varying needs of those high schools. And so they then convened 5 of the 7 schools last year, and 4 of those schools want to continue that work moving forward this year. But it was you know, McCormick is a grant-making institution, and we also have the democracy schools work. So it was a way to really meet the needs of some of our schools with some of our grant partners.
We have another question. So in particular for Jason and Eileen, what work did you need to do personally to come to terms with white privilege in order to engage your faculty on the issue?
That work is still ongoing. We're actually starting a culturally responsive pedagogy cohort this year, and we're starting to explore the Zaretta Hammond approach. And for me personally, that has been a process. So I can't speak specifically as to what exact work has been done, but that is where I am headed professionally and personally as we look into, you know, continuing this conversation.
Like Jason, I would say that work is ongoing, but I also feel like it's probably never not going to be ongoing. For me personally, I'm not even sure I could go back and pinpoint where it started exactly, but I feel like I had to do a lot of work, I think, to come to understand my own racial consciousness and understand how I show up as a white woman. Partly that was something I could make progress on, or I had to understand because I was teaching students in diverse classrooms and knew that I wasn't always adept at making spaces that they felt were easy for them to enter. And once you start asking yourself that question, like what am I doing or not doing that is not, how is it that I am not removing barriers to entry? And how is it that I am not creating more open access for all of my kids to access my curriculum? Could my curriculum be more culturally open? That all of that work had to start with me personally. And not to sound like an egoist or anything, but that is just, I couldn't really lead a building in doing that work unless I had done some of that work myself. So coming to understand whiteness and studying it and recognizing when I'm showing up in whiteness, and recognizing distinction between white as a race and whiteness as a cultural force, recognizing how then that cultural force has shaped most of our decisions about schooling and many, many other things. And then recognizing where I'm complicit and where I'm not. I think probably the chapter of the work that I'm on right now is, I think I alluded to this a little bit before, I don't think I can dismantle a system of whiteness entirely by myself. I'm a principal housed in a district, housed in communities that are pretty attached to it. So how can I both uphold a system of whiteness and dismantle it at the same time is very confusing. Am I going to be alert enough to see it, or is it just going to be automatic for me the way breathing is or blinking? So how does my situation give me access to opportunities to be an ally for my students who don't have the same access to power that I have had throughout my entire life in schools? So, the work starts with me, and ultimately, though I can try pretty hard to shape how it might be available to my staff and my community, it kind of ends with me because that's about all I can do. I can't make somebody study whiteness. I can make it available to them, and I can become more skilled in facilitating conversations that will lead to that sort of honesty and accountability and love. Yeah, I don't know, not a great answer, but there it is.
A heartfelt answer for sure, and I appreciate that. And I think all of us have to be vulnerable and maybe be willing to take the risk to have the conversation, because really the ultimate privilege is to refuse to have the conversation, right? So if we could just, we're really making progress. Sonia, do you have any last minute comments before we give this back over to Dr. Ruscitti to close us out with some of her reflections?
I feel so honored and privileged. I was a classroom teacher a long time ago, and not being in the classroom, I'm so grateful to be able to work with such amazing educators that are really moving this work along in your schools. So I thank you so much for sharing your reflections and experiences, and hope that this was helpful for our listeners. And yeah, just really appreciate the work and leadership that you all are demonstrating every day.
Darlene?
I just want to echo that. It's two things. One, you can see why I am such a supporter of the Illinois Democracy Schools. Here we go. I think that's absolutely great. And also two, just the importance of leadership. And you can see here with, our three panelists, their demonstration of just being good leaders. It matters. So I want to say thank you to each and every one of you, and just keep doing that great work. And if we can ever be of assistance, any of us, all of us, please never hesitate. So thank you all. Mary Ellen, you're muted.
In the chat box, I shared a sign in, sign out sheet that will take you less than 10 seconds to fill out. So if you would do that for ISB purposes, if you would like professional development credit today. In addition, I'm going to send a follow-up email out when the recording is up so that you can share it in your networks, as well as some of the great resources that were shared today. I will do that in the follow-up email as well. We're going to stop recording now, but I will stay behind, and I think maybe a few of us can stay behind if you have some questions that you would like to share in the chat box. So thank you very much.